Hello, and welcome to the Usefulati, the show that turns the writing of the world's most useful people into audio episodes you can listen to on your drive to work. Today we have a blog from Casey Handmer, the founder and CEO of Terraform Industries, a startup that's turning water and air into carbon-neutral natural gas with solar power. See the description for more, and let's jump in.
How much ancient text might we recover from the library in the Villa of Papyri in Herculaneum? How much was there to begin with? We know it was a huge luxurious villa filled with exquisite artworks. Before the printing press, books were one of the highest value items one could own, especially on a per volume or per weight basis. We know that the Epicurean philosopher Philodemus lived and worked in the villa, probably to confer further prestige on the site. If you were a rich Roman keen to flaunt your taste and patronage of the arts, your library must be a working library, containing not only thousands of books but also scribes to curate and hand-copy damaged texts and even renowned scholars and poets in the process of generating new work. For the rest of this post I explain how I generated a rough estimate of how many scrolls might remain unread. It's safe to assume that when the villa was built it was immediately stocked with a comprehensive library of essentially all the well-regarded ancient texts that survived to that point. We know that thousands of works we no longer have had survived at the time the villa was built, indeed for hundreds of years afterwards, but scrolls decay over time, fires were common, and duplication was a costly endeavor with a finite capacity. I estimate that about 30% of all texts will disappear every 50 years, augmented by newly created work. The rate of text creation probably also varied over time, but it's hard to separate this in the historical record from periods where a lot of texts were lost. It's also possible, though I don't include it in my analysis, that the villa's library incorporated earlier collections already curated and preserved, and thus have a higher than expected proportion of higher value ancient texts. There is some wild speculation that since the villa was built about 30 years before one of the burnings of the Library of Alexandria that some of its surviving texts may have been moved to the villa. Richard Carrier also has a fabulous post discussing some much lamented lost ancient texts that may be in the library. I also assume that during the library's roughly 160-year life it was updated, contemporary works were added or even created there, and copies were made of rare and popular works. The Apostle Paul is thought to have traveled through the area in about AD 60. Could some trace remain? There are about 280 attested Latin and Greek authors who wrote prior to the destruction of the library in the AD 79 eruption. Some of these are known to have written dozens or even hundreds of scrolls. One scroll typically contained up to 1,200 lines or 10,000 words, about 1/10 of a typical paperback novel. For most of these authors, we have fewer than 600 words, just a handful of fragments, quotations, or summaries. Just a dozen or so authors exist in any length and none are even close to complete. In total, we have about 30 million words, equivalent to 3,000 scrolls or 300 modern books that has come down to us, which is less than 1% of what was written. I analyzed two separate data sources to graph ancient texts by volume and authorship. The first is the Lab collection, a single large bookcase containing much of the ancient corpora, an English translation pictured below. The second is the Perseus.Tufts database, with the help of curator Alison Babu. Both give consistent answers. We do not yet know how large the ancient library at the Villa of Papyri was, but we can make some inferences. We have already recovered between 600 and 1,200 scrolls, mostly from a single room that may have been Philodemus' private study during his life. He died in about 35 BC, about a century before the villa was destroyed. We know the villa was enormous, sumptuous, and owned at one point by Calpurnius Piso, one of the richest and most powerful people ever to live in the ancient world. We know of attested libraries with around 60,000 scrolls, while the Library of Alexandria was supposed to have held as many as 400,000. Thomas Jefferson's private library, totaling 6,487 books, was sold to the Library of Congress in 1815 for $23,950, or about $500,000 in modern money. In ancient terms, this would be about 60,000 scrolls and significantly more valuable. For my estimate, I assumed the library held a total of around 25,000 scrolls, of which roughly 10,000 were contemporary to the library's existence and 15,000 predated it, with their dates matching the previous assumption about natural loss of ancient texts. Obviously, the library will contain no texts produced after its destruction in AD 79. Pliny the Elder, whose extant works make up about 100 scrolls on this graph scale, actually died near Herculaneum during the eruption while trying to rescue people by ship, as described by his nephew Pliny the Younger, whose later works cannot appear in the library. The blue bars represent extant text, all of it, in the Lab collection, from about 240 discrete authors, almost all fragmentary, starting with Homer and ending at the eruption, perhaps just 3,000 scrolls in total. The red bars represent the number of unique texts that may be in the library by age and volume. We do not know for certain whether the lack of extant texts between about 300 BC and 100 BC was due to excessive loss during this period, or a lack of creation after waning of the peak of the classical ancient Greek Golden Age. In this graph I assumed the former, but we are now in a position to find out. The Perseus data is given below. It shows a wider time scale, but the patterns are broadly similar. A pulse of ancient texts written during classical Greece, the late Roman Republic, and then the early Imperial Rome. 30 million words preserved by medieval copyists is a lot better than nothing. With a concerted effort one can read all of it in a few years. And yet, the total represents probably less than 1% of what anyone who had access to the villa's library could have accessed, more writing and knowledge than anyone could consume in a lifetime. Even reading just the 600 scrolls that have already been excavated could revolutionize our understanding of the ancient world, but excavating and conserving the entire collection inferred to exist at the villa will literally rewrite 1,000 years of historical scholarship. I first learned about the Herculaneum scrolls maybe 20 years ago, studying Latin in my teen years, and wondered if maybe my generation of scholars would be lucky enough to see a major advance. But I didn't dream in a million years that we would have the technology and resources to recover an entire ancient library. But it gets even better than that. It is highly unlikely that the Villa of Papyri was the only luxury villa destroyed by the eruption. Indeed, we know that it was a popular place, perhaps similar to Pacifica or Sea Ranch or Malibu today. And so it is highly unlikely that the Villa of Papyri contains the only ancient library destroyed and preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius.